Welcome students to Unit 1, the theoretical perspective. So we're looking at the behavioral, social, cognitive, and constructivist views. These are not the only views that we will be reviewing or looking at, but these are the ones that we're going to be starting with. And as we progress through the module, we'll be picking up some more views as we go along, such as Erik Erikson's view of psychosocial development. And this refers specifically to the various stages through which individuals will pass through their lifetime. So firstly, we ask, what is a theoretical perspective? So a theoretical perspective, as you may already know, is basically like a set of way a very basic way of viewing the world and society, and it influences how we information and how we interpret this information. And it's really these assumptions about reality that inform things like the questions we ask, the kinds of answers that we come to as a result. It can be understood as a lens through which we look, the way in which we see the world, the way in which we understand things to be true. Besides a lens, people often call it a frame or framework, and it includes and excludes certain things from our view and certain things that we perceive to be true or the way we understand that the world is functioning in. So, for example, in the behavioral view, which we'll get to in a little while, it talks about a stimulus and response. So every time you look at the world or you look at circumstances, situations, you think of what was the stimulus here and what was the response, and then you come to an accepted truth, or you'll come to a conclusion about the situation. So the field of whatever it is, the field of sociology, of psychology, whatever you want to talk about, it's a theoretical perspective. It's based on an assumption that social systems such as society and the family actually exist, that culture and social structure and milestones and behavioral challenges, cognitive challenges, that these are real. It's also important, a theoretical perspective is also important for research because it helps us to organize our thoughts. It makes things clear to others. So if someone who has already adopted a theoretical approach, such as a behavioral perspective, if they read work, or they read a piece, or they read article, or they read your work, if you say you're working from a behavioral perspective, they understand how you came to the conclusion. So there are many perspectives, and it really is the way in which you decide to view the world that you'll find a perspective that best suits your way of working and your way of functioning. And the behavioral perspective focuses mainly on observable behavior, what we can see. Okay, and so here learning mainly takes place through conditioning. The environment therefore influences our behavior, and behaviorists believe that people's behaviors are because of the interactions with the environment. Like, for example, people become conditioned or molded to respond in a certain way based on responses like feedback, praise, and reward. So, for example, if a child that packs their bag for school and they get praise or good feedback, they're more likely to do it again. But if there is a punishment, such as a timeout because they didn't pack their bag, then it's less likely that that will occur. But obviously, for children, it needs to be repeated. There needs to be a repetition in that response so that they will really adopt. And then, of course, learning is described through stimuli and response. And here, the focus is really on observable events rather than events that occur inside a person's head. So it's not about thoughts or feelings or beliefs, but it's really about what you can see, the behavior specifically. Behaviorists believe that learning must involve a behavioral change. So it's the change, you can't just say that change has taken place. You actually have to observe a change in behavior for behaviorists to say, yes, okay, a change has taken place. And then learning must result when stimulus and response occur close together in time. So if there was a stimulus, if the response happens right after, then we can say that the relationship exists. But if it happens a lot longer after the stimulus was there, then you won't connect the two. So learners, for example, must associate their response with a stimulus, and for that to occur, the two must happen in conjunction with one another. So they must be closely linked. So if a child, for example, doesn't pack their bag and they get a time won't necessarily, although you tell them that, I'm just using this as an example, they may not necessarily associate the two because the response happens so much later than the stimulus, which was the event or the behavior that they. Animals and humans, which is interesting, learn in similar ways according to behaviorists because they've performed a lot of studies and they believe that the studies show that behavior in animals and in adults happen in very similar ways. Although there are many, the main behaviorists that we will be looking at are John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, B.F. Skinner. So many of these names should be ones that you've heard before. John Watson was really known as the father of behaviorism, and he was the one that initiated this movement. Ivan Pavlov, he developed classical conditioning, which was learning through association. So two stimuli are linked together to produce a new learned response in a person or an animal. So we're going to talk about this as we continue through this video. Then B.F. Skinner, you may have heard his name quite a bit. He developed operant conditioning, which is learning by association, and behavior is modified through punishment or rewards, as I spoke about in the previous slide. Edward Thorndike developed the law of effect, and this is a response with a positive effect. Response with a positive effect or positive result is more likely to reoccur, and adversely, a negative effect or a negative result is less likely to occur again because the person didn't like the event that happened or the event that occurred. Okay, so first we'll be looking at the works of John Watson. And John Watson was, as we know, is known as the father of behaviorism. He based much on his work on the theories developed by John Locke, who I think you'll remember from Educational Psychology 1, where he spoke about the tabula rasa, which is basically that a human being is a blank slate. A human being or a human infant is born and they are a blank slate with no prior knowledge, no prior ideas, and it's only the experience that they receive through their various senses, which according to Locke, provides the material which forms the human mind. So by associating different experiences, complex chains of ideas can be developed and new combinations can be found. And Locke also believed that all human thought and mental life was formed by association. So we're associating one thing with another, and that is how we learned. John Watson believed this, but he also said that there's no free will really. Rather, our environment determines our behavior. So we don't decide what we want to do. Our environment tells us this is how you behave, this is how you respond, and so on and so forth. John Watson was a believer that and he claimed that he could teach any child any skill. Gave him a child, he said that if you wanted this child to be an engineer, he could teach the child all the skills they needed to know, and they would become a specialist in this field. And he also believed that emotions rather are trivial or damaging. So Ivan Pavlov developed classical conditioning, and classical conditioning is something that you may have heard of or you may have seen, even if you didn't understand that that's what it was. So it's more about association. So associating one thing with another, and that is how we learn. And he did this through the study of dogs, and he worked around the concept of conditioned reflexes. So remember, everything that I'm going through now is just an introduction to the works, and you need to do a lot more research. And as we progress through this unit, you'll be given more readings on each of these perspectives. Okay, and Pavlov also said that the natural reflex that occurs in response to a stimulus is innate, that it is part of human beings, and that the body can be conditioned by its surroundings. So the way I understand this is that, for example, if you are in an environment which you know is unsafe and the stimulus is that there's crime happening in your environment, you have a heightened sense of awareness when you're walking in your community. And that is how your body has actually been conditioned to your surroundings. So the experiment that he did is that he used classical conditioning, or he used the concept of classical conditioning, and he said, let's try to prove this using a dog. So classical conditioning firstly involves pairing a natural occurring stimulus with a response. Then a previous neutral stimulus is paired with a naturally occurring stimulus. The neutral stimulus begins to evoke the same response without the natural occurring stimulus. So what does this mean? It means that, for example, excuse me, let me go a bit ahead of ourselves there. So with classical conditioning, if we have a dog, the dog sees food and saliva will then form in his mouth, and that is the response to the food. It's unconditioned, but it's the natural response to the food. Before conditioning, there's a fork, which is a neutral stimulus. He looks at the fork, nothing happens because it's just a fork. But when conditioning takes place, you pair the fork with the food, and salivation takes place, because now the food is the stimulus. The food is the unconditioned stimulus. Usually the food elicits salivation. And if you do this enough times, when the dog sees just the fork, which has now become the conditioned response, he salivates because he associates the food with a tuning fork. So can you see how an innate behavior like salivating can be conditioned or associated with something that does not necessarily cause salivating in the first place? And this is classical conditioning. We apply it in our classrooms even though we don't know that we do. So for example, when the teacher comes into the classroom and she puts her hand up in the air, that doesn't really mean anything. But when she puts her hand up in the air and says, when my hand is up in the air, everyone needs to be in their seats and their books have to be on their desks. She doesn't have to explain it next time. All she has to do is put her hand in the air and the students will know that this is what they're supposed to do. The work of B.F. Skinner was around operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner was a major contributor to experimental psychology. And he said that internal thoughts and motivations do not necessarily or should not necessarily be considered in relation to explaining behavior. It was more that outside, external, observable causes of human behavior are what we should really be paying attention to. He was interested in how the consequences of actions influence behavior. So because there's a specific consequence, we are more likely to perform or behave in the same way or not. Operant, which we understand to be active behavior that operates upon the environment to generate consequences. And he further said that actions that are followed by reinforcement will be strengthened and more likely to occur in the future. So if a teacher praises the learners for having their books out when she puts her hand up, they are more likely to put their books out next time because of the praise. But if there's a punishment due to not putting their books out on the table, they are less likely to not put their books out on the table. And when I say less likely, we obviously leave room for differences in behavior because of children not wanting to do something for a specific reason. So you might not necessarily prescribe to the behavioral perspective, and I personally do not prescribe to it completely, but I think that certain tenets of it can be accepted as truth or accepted as how things really are. And B.F. Skinner further said that there are positive and negative reinforcers. So this we could call the praise or the punishment to certain events. So operant conditioning, there was an experiment done on operant conditioning. So there are specific consequences associated with voluntary behavior. So they used a mouse and they had a lever. And when the mouse pressed the lever, they got pellets, and they were more likely to do that again and again and again. But when the same lever gave them a little bit of a shock, they were less likely and almost didn't want to do it again to press that lever. And that is just the way that they found out about operant conditioning through these various types of experiments. So every time there's a negative response elicited, the mouse would no longer perform in that way or do that action or take that course of action. And in this case, it was pressing on the lever.